Back with you on the news feed late night. Of course, as the country pushes to vaccinate over 2/3 of the population, can citizens be forced to take vaccines legally? Joining me now to talk about this is public health lawyer Safura Abdool Karim. Safura, good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight on the news feed late night.
Good evening, and thank you for having me.
Well, it's unclear at the moment whether the government will be able to get a large section of South African public to actually take the COVID-19 vaccine, because, I mean, if you hear a lot of what's going on social media, many people are reluctant to go for it. Now, with herd immunity requiring that we vaccinate around 40 million of South Africans, is there a case for making a COVID-19 mandatory?
So you're absolutely right. Before you can even begin to think about making vaccination compulsory, you need to have enough doses to give everybody the vaccine. But once you have enough vaccine, the question of whether or not people will take it becomes critical. And there was a survey done a few months ago that showed that 33% of South Africans would be unwilling to take the vaccine. So at some point, compelled vaccination may become a reality in South Africa. At the moment, there are two legal mechanisms that the government can use to force people to be vaccinated. One is in terms of the Disaster Management Act, and the other is in terms of the National Health Act. Under both of those, the government can apply to a court to force someone to receive a vaccine if they are unwilling to do so.
What does that mean in practice? I mean, we know already we are forced to be on lockdown. You don't necessarily have a choice, even though your individual right says you've got a right to movement, right to freedom. But under, of course, the current regulations, we are forced, all of us, to be on lockdown. So how will that work as far as vaccines are concerned?
There is definitely a tension between individual rights and community rights and sort of the broader interest of public health when it comes to an issue like compelled vaccination. Court cases during the COVID pandemic have illustrated that there's a remarkable deference and understanding of the important public health objectives of certain limitations of individuals' freedoms. However, there is also this additional issue of if the government requires somebody to be vaccinated, what controls and measures should be put in place? Now, of course, you can have a criminal sanction, and that's what the Disaster Management Act contemplates, where if you don't obey, you can be sentenced to up to 6 months in prison. But there are also other legal ways in which you can incentivize people to get vaccinated. For example, a lot of countries have been talking about COVID immunity passports, not allowing people to travel without a COVID vaccine. So it's more likely that what we'll see is those types of measures where people need a vaccine in order to travel or go to school. And that will be the way in which people are, quote unquote, incentivized or forced to get a vaccine rather than the government individually obtaining court orders to compel vaccination in individual cases.
So you won't be getting the security cluster coming to your house and knocking and holding you down and forcing the jab down your shoulder. It would be a case where, for example, will employers, for example, be compelled by legislation to have their employees vaccinated, or otherwise they will not gain access to their employment?
That is an example of a measure that could be implemented to try and get a higher vaccine uptake. Whether or not that's constitutional is something that I think would need to be debated in the courts, because there is a difference between sort of individual cases where somebody might be causing a particular risk, and therefore there's a justification for forcing them to get a vaccine versus at a wide scale compelling people, excluding people from the workforce or limiting their economic prospects as a result of their choice not to get the vaccine. So I think those are two very different situations. At the moment, there's only precedent for in individual extreme circumstances getting a court order to force somebody to be vaccinated. There isn't sort of this precedent for wide-scale vaccination and exclusion from the workplace if you don't do it.
Yeah. Those who are for this idea of mandatory vaccination, here's the argument that they put forward. They're saying there's less, the vaccination should be compulsory because the less burdensome it is for an individual to do something that prevents harm to others, the greater the harm prevented and the stronger the ethical reason for mandating it. I mean, will that pass in terms of the South African Constitution?
So our constitution involves wherever you have an instance where somebody's rights are being infringed, there's a balancing that needs to take place. And that balancing isn't just between competing rights. So, for example, there's a right to life and a right to health that lies on the side of on the other side of arguments like the right to bodily integrity. However, there are broader interests of society that also are involved in that balancing act. And so, what we've seen during the COVID pandemic is that these individual rights to dignity and bodily integrity and overall autonomy are being sort of almost subservient to the broader public interest and community interest of preventing the spread of the pandemic. So it's very likely that we'll see the same type of reasoning and the same type of balancing happening in the case of COVID vaccination. Because remember, many of these questions arose when there was widespread community testing. And what we saw there is a willingness from the courts to uphold public health objective of limiting the spread of the pandemic.
Is equating this to wearing a seatbelt going too far? Because others are saying, well, I mean, just like a seatbelt, it's uncomfortable for certain people, but everybody recognizes in society that it will benefit the broader society for me to have my seatbelt on. Equally so, a vaccine would benefit the broader society, and therefore it might be uncomfortable for you, but certainly for the benefit of the greater good, you might want to make it mandatory.
I think there's also an important distinction to be made between people who are choosing not to have the vaccine for ideological reasons and people who cannot take the vaccine because of health reasons or other issues. Now, it's very unlikely that there's going to be some kind of implementation where people who physically cannot take the vaccine are compelled to do so. That group of people are actually the group of people we're trying to protect with herd immunity. The so the seatbelt analogy is slightly different because now you're not just talking about your own safety, you're actually talking about everybody else's as well. However, the seatbelt analogy beyond that is actually a very good analogy. And the only thing I would caution is that we have found in public health that using criminal sanctions is not really the way to get the public to buy into initiatives. And generally, criminalizing something the way that wearing a seatbelt is not wearing a seatbelt is criminalized tends to undermine your public health objectives. What you need to do is you need to have people understand what the vaccine is doing. They need to have trust and faith the vaccine that they're receiving is safe and effective and is going to do what it needs to do. So I think before you even begin to contemplate criminal sanctions, it's very important for policymakers and members of government to think about how they can better communicate around the vaccine to address some of the misinformation that causes vaccine hesitancy.
Yeah. Now, those who are arguing against vaccination are saying, well, the pandemic is actually not deadly enough to justify a mandatory vaccination. I mean, what do you say to that? Looking at the numbers and how this virus has impacted the globe, is it reason enough to make it mandatory?
So, I mean, obviously, my expertise is as a lawyer, not as an epidemiologist, but I think that we all can recognize that this pandemic is not just like the flu, as many people claimed in January last year. This is quite a serious pandemic. That's why we've had such a stringent response. And so, really thinking about vaccination as the next step in our COVID response and kind of applying the same logic that enabled us to support a lockdown in early last year, that supported widespread community testing, that allowed us to rethink how we socialize with one another and understand that mask wearing should be compulsory. All of those same kinds of approaches should be applied when we're thinking about vaccines. This is not something that's totally different to the kinds of things we've been doing now. These are all public health interventions. They're all aimed at controlling this pandemic. And this pandemic is serious. We want to get back to a normal where we can see each other and hug each other. And this is part of achieving that normal.
Now, considering that, for example, in other parts of the world, like Brazil, the Supreme Court there in December said that local government can actually introduce measures to make it mandatory for people to take vaccination. Would South Africans find themselves in a situation where certain countries would actually not allow them to come in unless they've taken this vaccine?
A lot of countries have spoken about introducing measures like that. I think it's unlikely that those measures are going to be introduced immediately because of vaccine inequity. You know, it would be radically unfair and grossly unfair for countries in the West or in Europe to limit travel from, for example, Africa, when we know that Africa as a continent and as a region is going to receive the vaccine much, much later. But it's very likely in a year or two that we will see measures like this being introduced across the globe, and many countries, especially with the cropping up of new variants and things like that, they're not going to be willing to take the risk of an outbreak beginning because people are traveling without being vaccinated. So it's very likely that our courts, if they're called upon to decide on the constitutionality of mandatory vaccination, will follow the lead of a country like Brazil. We follow their decision making is quite similar to ours, but then it's also very likely that we'll be unable to travel to countries like that unless we ourselves are vaccinated. So both of those things are very good harbingers of what might lie ahead for compelled vaccination in South Africa.
All right, Safura, thanks for your insights tonight. I appreciate it. That's public health lawyer Safura Abdool Karim there with us. When the newsfeed late night continues next, what will be the fate of 983 nurses who staged a sit-in some of our health facilities here?